Hey guys, welcome back to another long, overly detailed history story you didn't know you needed to fall asleep to. So dim the lights, maybe grab a drink, and let's drift into one of the most hauntingly persistent chapters of American memory, the Civil War. Yes, that one. The one your high school textbook tried to summarize in 2 pages with the words slavery, Lincoln, and Gettysburg. But tonight, we're not doing the battle maps and cannon smoke. We're going for the slow burn, the kind that seeps into the soil, the politics, the culture, and just never really goes away. Because, honestly, the American Civil War never really ended. It just changed form, got a facelift, and kept showing up uninvited to every family reunion in U.S. history. So let's tuck in and rewind to the mid-1800s, when the country looked like a moody teenager with big ideals and terrible impulse control. Setting the scene, America before the breakup. Picture it, the early 19th century. America's young, loud, and still figuring itself out. It's got that post-revolution glow, but hasn't quite decided if it's a noble experiment in democracy or just a glorified real estate project with guns. The founding fathers are long gone, and they're whole. We'll deal with slavery later. Policy has aged about as well as milk in the sun. By the 1850s, the country was split like a bad relationship. One side running on cotton and enslaved labor, the other running on factories, abolitionist guilt, and moral superiority. The South saw itself as a proud, traditional society, chivalry, plantations, and heritage, which sounds poetic until you realize it was all built on human suffering. The North, meanwhile, liked to imagine it was modern, industrious, and a little smug about being on the right side of history. Spoiler, it wasn't always that simple. Because while the North didn't have slavery in the same way, plenty of Northern businesses made money off Southern cotton. And racism wasn't exactly contained by the Mason-Dixon line. It just wore different clothes. The boiling point. Now, the tension had been simmering for decades. Every time Congress tried to keep things balanced between free and slave states, it was like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. There was the Missouri Compromise in 1820, which basically said, okay, fine, one free state, one slave state, and we'll draw a line like we're splitting a dorm room. Then came the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and about a dozen other political band-aids that never stopped the bleeding. Meanwhile, abolitionists were turning up the volume. You had people like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Beecher Stowe, and John Brown, who went from writing fiery pamphlets to literally leading an armed raid. Brown's failed attempt to start a slave revolt in 1859 made him a hero to some, a terrorist to others, and a ghost that would haunt the South's nightmares. By the time Abraham Lincoln won the presidency in 1860, the South didn't even wait to see what he'd do. They just packed their bags, declared we're out, and started their own country, the Confederate States of America. Because nothing says states, rights, like immediately forming a government dedicated to keeping slavery alive. 4 years of misery. The war itself, from 1861 to 1865, is one of those things Americans still argue about, which is honestly impressive given it's been over 160 years. The North called it the War of the Rebellion. The South called it the war between the states. Some people just called it a complete nightmare. It started with shots fired at Fort Sumter, South Carolina. And from there, it spiraled into 4 years of mud, disease, and death on a scale the country had never imagined. More than 600,000 people died, more than all other U.S. wars combined up to that point. And these weren't faceless soldiers in faraway lands. They were neighbors, cousins, and classmates. Entire towns lost nearly every young man they had. The irony, most of those men didn't even own slaves. For many Southerners, it was about loyalty and identity. For Northerners, it became about preserving the Union, and later, finally, about ending slavery. Lincoln, who never exactly planned to be the great emancipator, gradually realized the war wasn't just about keeping the country together. It was about redefining what that country actually was. When he issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, freeing enslaved people in Confederate territory, it changed everything. It turned the war from a family dispute into a moral crusade. Though, again, it only freed enslaved people in places that weren't under Union control, which is like saying your diet starts tomorrow. The end that was. By 1865, the Confederacy was collapsing. General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox, and everyone tried to pretend that meant the war was over. Spoiler, it was. Because 5 days later, Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, a Southern actor who apparently thought shooting the president in a theater would somehow redeem the South. It didn't. It just made everything worse. Lincoln's death robbed the country of the one man who might have actually pulled off a peaceful reunion. Instead, the task fell to Andrew Johnson, a man who, to put it gently, was like putting a bandage on a volcano. Johnson wanted to be lenient toward the South. Congress wanted revenge. And newly freed Black Americans wanted actual freedom, not just the theoretical kind. So the country entered what historians politely call Reconstruction, but which could also be described as the decade everyone pretended things were fine while nothing was fine. Reconstruction, the almost dream. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the federal government tried something radical, rebuilding the South and integrating formerly enslaved people into society. For a moment, a brief flickering moment, it almost worked. Black men voted, held office, and started schools. There were Black senators, congressmen, and local leaders. It was one of those rare points in history where you could feel a new world trying to emerge. But America has a habit of blinking at the worst possible times. By the 1870s, Northern politicians got bored, Southern whites got angry, and white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan got busy making sure progress didn't last. Reconstruction collapsed in 1877 when federal troops withdrew from the South. Almost immediately, Southern states rolled out black codes and later Jim Crow laws, a polite-sounding term for legal apartheid. And just like that, a century of racial segregation and violence began. So, in a twisted way, the Civil War didn't end in 1865. It just changed costume. The long shad. Fast forward to the early 20th century. America's industrial, urban, and pretending it's all moved on. But under the surface, the old fault lines are still there. The South mythologized the Confederacy into something noble and tragic. The whole, lost cause, narrative that tried to turn slaveholders into romantic heroes. You've seen it. The statues, the flags, the nostalgic novels about gallant gentlemen and faithful servants. It was revisionist history at its sleepiest. But it worked. For decades, schools, movies, and even textbooks sold that story as fact. Gone with the Wind became the bedtime story version of the Civil War, all hoop skirts and noble sadness, minus the whole enslaving human beings part. Meanwhile, the North congratulated itself for winning the moral high ground while still running segregated neighborhoods and unequal schools. So yeah, nobody really won the peace. Why it still matters. Now, you might be thinking, okay, sure, but that was a century and a half ago. Why does it still shape America today? Well, because the war was never just about politics or geography. It was about identity. About who gets to be American and what that even means. The Civil War forced the country to confront its own contradictions: liberty and slavery, equality and hierarchy, freedom and fear. Those contradictions didn't go away, they just evolved. You can still see them in modern debates, over states, rights, race, federal authority, and even flags. When people argue about heritage, freedom, or who the real America is, they're often replaying the same 19th century argument with better Wi-Fi. The ghosts of that war are everywhere. In the political map that still roughly follows Union versus Confederate lines. In the monuments people argue over. And in the quiet cultural divide that shapes everything from voting patterns to school curriculums. It's not that Americans can't move on. It's that they were never all moving in the same direction to begin with. The emotional hangover. One of the strangest things about the Civil War's legacy is how personal it still feels. Most Americans have ancestors who fought on one side or the other. And depending on what part of the country you're from, you were probably raised with a very different version of the story. For Southerners, it became a story of loss, pride, and resistance. For Northerners, it was about victory, unity, and being right. Neither side fully confronted the deeper trauma underneath, that the war had torn families, burned cities, and left a moral wound that never healed. Even today, that wound shows up in strange ways, in how Americans talk about government, race, and patriotism. It's there in the distrust of institutions, in the romanticizing of rebellion, and in the constant need to pick a side. The Civil War made America a nation obsessed with dualities: freedom versus control, unity versus independence, red vs blue. And once you start seeing it, you can't unsee it. The South's second life. After Reconstruction failed, the South built a new identity around victimhood and defiance. They couldn't win the war, so they won the story. That's when Confederate statues started popping up, not right after the war, but decades later, during the height of segregation. They weren't memorials, they were statements. Little granite reminders of who was still in charge. Schools were named after Confederate generals. Flags were redesigned. History was rewritten to make the Confederacy seem like a noble, lost cause, instead of a rebellion to preserve slavery. And for generations, kids grew up hearing that version of history, quiet, sanitized, and deeply wrong. That's why the Civil War still feels alive today. Because it wasn't buried, it was mythologized. The North's forgetfulness. And the North, for its part, did what it does best, moved on and stopped thinking about it. Industrialization, immigration, and progress became the new national story. The messy reality of Reconstruction and racial inequality got swept under the rug, or, more accurately, left for the South to deal with. But the North's amnesia came with a price. By pretending racism was a Southern problem, it allowed systemic inequality to keep evolving quietly in housing, education, and law enforcement. So while the South was busy defending its monuments, the North was quietly building walls of its own, just made of redlining and zoning laws instead of marble. Hey again. If you're still awake, impressive. If you're half asleep, even better, because that's exactly the state you should be in to talk about Reconstruction. This is the era of America's collective hangover after the Civil War. The guns were silent, the flags were folded, but the country. Still a mess. Emotionally, politically, morally, you name it. And this is where the United States, fresh from a war over slavery, had a real chance to do something bold, to actually become the country it kept claiming to be. Spoiler, it tried for about 12 minutes, then gave up. So settle in. We're about to float through the strange twilight of Reconstruction, the time America pretended to rebuild, while secretly stitching its old habits back together with new thread. The aftermath nobody wanted. Picture the South in 1865. Cities burned, railroads torn apart, plantations in ruins. It looked like someone had shaken the entire region and forgotten to put it back together. 4 million people had just been freed from slavery, but freedom, as it turned out, didn't come with a starter pack. No land, no money, no education, and a government already debating how much freedom was too much. President Andrew Johnson, the guy who took over after Lincoln's assassination, decided that the best way to heal the nation was to let the South do whatever it wanted. Because, that worked out so well the first time. Johnson issued mass pardons to Confederate leaders, let them reclaim their property, and basically said, "Welcome back, guys, no hard feelings." Within months, many of the same people who led the rebellion were back in charge, writing new laws called Black Codes. These codes were designed to control newly freed Black people without technically reintroducing slavery. Things like vagrancy laws, which let authorities arrest anyone who wasn't employed, and then force them to work off fines. So, basically slavery with extra paperwork. Congress steps in reluctantly. Now, Congress took one look at Johnson's approach and collectively said, "Absolutely not." Radical Republicans, the progressive wing of the party, decided if the president wouldn't rebuild the South, they would. They passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, created the Freedmen's Bureau, and pushed the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship to anyone born in the U.S., regardless of race. It was ambitious, idealistic, and surprisingly modern. The Freedmen's Bureau set up schools, negotiated labor contracts, and even provided food aid. For a brief, shining moment, it felt like America might actually follow through on its promise of equality. But progress is exhausting, and nothing drains a nation faster than having to be good for more than 5 minutes. The South reacts, predictably. Southern states, still bitter about losing the war, decided to lose the peace too. They refused to ratify the new amendments, staged riots, and formed secret societies like the Ku Klux Klan, whose main activities included night rides, arson, and murdering anyone who seemed too free for their liking. It's one of those dark chapters where domestic terrorism doesn't even begin to cover it. These weren't random acts of chaos. They were organized campaigns to restore white supremacy through fear. And the terrifying part, it worked. By 1870, the Klan and other groups had killed thousands. Black leaders were targeted, schools were burned, and entire communities were forced back into submission. Federal troops occasionally intervened, but enforcement was inconsistent and political will was fading fast. The North, busy industrializing and making money, started to lose interest. They'd done their part right, passed some laws, said the right things, time to move on. A glimpse of a different future. But for a while, just a little while, things did look different. During Reconstruction, Black men voted in large numbers. They held public office at every level, from local councils to Congress. Hiram Revels of Mississippi became the first Black U.S. Senator. He replaced Jefferson Davis, the former president of the Confederacy. Talk about poetic justice. Public schools were established in the South for the first time, often built with help from freed communities themselves. Black churches became centers of education and political organization, and would remain that way for generations. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And maybe that's what scared people the most. Because if equality actually started working, it would upend the entire social order the South was built on, and challenge the North's comfortable sense of superiority. The Panic of 1873, and the return of apathy. Then came the Panic of 1873, a massive financial crash that plunged the country into depression. And just like that, the national conversation shifted from civil rights to stock prices. It's amazing how fast justice for all turns into, "We'll fix it later" when the economy tanks. Republicans lost seats in Congress, and Northern voters started saying things like, "Why are we still sending money to the South?" By the mid-1870s, white supremacist groups, now calling themselves Redeemers, because irony never sleeps, were taking back Southern governments one by one. They promised redemption from Northern interference and Black rule, as if democracy itself was the problem. Violence and voter intimidation were their main campaign strategies, and shockingly, it worked better than any ballot box. 1877, the Great Retreat. By 1876, the presidential election between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden was so close it made Florida in 2000 look organized. The results were contested, chaos reigned, and Congress had to strike a deal, the Compromise of 1877. Hayes got the presidency. In return, he agreed to withdraw federal troops from the South. That one decision ended Reconstruction overnight. It was, in essence, a political trade-off. You can have equality, or you can have peace, pick one. America chose peace. Or at least the quiet version of it. The birth of Jim Crow. With federal troops gone, Southern states wasted no time. They rewrote their constitutions, introduced poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses, all designed to disenfranchise Black voters while pretending it was about education or civic integrity. And just like that, white supremacy reinvented itself as law. Jim Crow wasn't a single policy, it was a culture. Segregated schools, buses, bathrooms, drinking fountains, even cemeteries. It was everyday apartheid, wrapped in manners and enforced by fear. If Reconstruction had been America's brief awakening, Jim Crow was its long, deliberate sleep. Memory wars. While all this was happening, the country also began rewriting its collective memory of the Civil War. Instead of remembering it as a brutal conflict over slavery, people started calling it a war between brothers. You know, like a tragic misunderstanding. Textbooks softened the edges, statues went up, and suddenly the Confederate soldier was recast as a noble, misunderstood hero. Because apparently, rewriting history is easier than confronting it. In the North, people were happy to buy into the myth of reconciliation. Let's just move forward, they said, while ignoring the millions being systematically denied basic rights. Unity over justice, the American specialty. Industrial North, forgotten South. As the South sank into racial segregation and agricultural stagnation, the North entered its Gilded Age, a glittering era of railroads, steel, and corruption. Cities grew, immigrants poured in, and the country congratulated itself on becoming a modern industrial power. Meanwhile, millions of Black Americans were trapped in a system of sharecropping that wasn't much better than slavery. They worked the same land, owed money to the same white landowners, and were legally bound by debts they could never escape. The Civil War had promised a rebirth. Instead, America built two worlds, one booming and bright, the other silent and shackled. The Great Migration, an escape attempt. By the early 1900s, things reached a breaking point. Black families began leaving the South in waves, heading north to cities like Chicago, Detroit, and New York. It was called the Great Migration, one of the largest internal movements of people in American history. They were looking for jobs, safety, dignity, basic things the South refused to offer. But racism, of course, is portable. Northern cities greeted them with housing segregation, job discrimination, and violent backlash. Still, the move changed the country's cultural map forever. From this migration came the Harlem Renaissance, jazz, blues, and the early roots of the civil rights movement. Even in escape, there was creation. Lost opportunities. Looking back, historians often say Reconstruction was the greatest missed opportunity in American history. It was the one time the country had both the moral momentum and the legal tools to create real equality, and it let them slip away. The 14th and 15th Amendments were revolutionary on paper. They promised equal protection and voting rights for all citizens. But rights without enforcement are just nicely worded wishes. And for nearly a century, those promises sat there, gathering dust while Jim Crow flourished. The courts looked the other way. Politicians shrugged. And a generation of Americans grew up believing segregation was just how things were. The echo chamber of denial. By the early 20th century, both North and South had settled into a comfortable lie. The North could feel morally superior. After all, they ended slavery. The South could feel noble. They lost with honor, apparently. And in between, the actual history got buried under marble and myth. Civil War veterans held reunions where Union and Confederate soldiers shook hands for the cameras, while Black Americans were banned from attending. It was unity for everyone, except the people who needed it most. That selective memory is why, even today, people can argue over Confederate flags as if they're just heritage. Because when a nation builds its identity on a compromise with its own past, truth becomes optional. The lingering divide. The Civil War ended in 1865, but its cultural lines never really faded. The South clung to its symbols and traditions. The North moved on, but never really looked back. And the political divide that began in those years, between a federal vision of America and a state-centered one, is still baked into the country's DNA. You can trace it straight through to modern debates about government, rights, and identity. Every time Americans argue about what the flag means, or who the country belongs to, they're pulling on threads that were spun in Reconstruction. The sleep of a century. So, the 19th century closed on a nation that had survived its greatest test, but only technically. The Union was intact. The Constitution was stronger. But the moral foundation, still cracked. And for the next 100 years, that fracture would shape everything from voting laws to housing, from music to politics. America had won the war, lost the peace, and then decided to stop thinking about it. Which, in a way, is the most American thing imaginable.